What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and today we're going to talk through my top 30 wide receiver rankings for fantasy football drafts this season. I figured we have training camp underway at this point, and why not lock in our early wide receiver rankings here, and we'll follow up again with our final rankings at the end of the offseason, right before week one. So we're going to do the whole thing. We're going to talk through all 30 players, break them up into tiers, break out the tier list, and go through the landscape that is the wide receivers right now in fantasy football. So as always, if you enjoy, make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go.
Yes, stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm frozen. She gon' let me.
Now, let's get ourselves situated in the tier maker. We have a bunch of tiers right now. We have the 101 candidates, elite wide receiver ones, high-end wide receiver twos, high-end wide receiver threes, and wide receiver 3/flexes. These are just how comfortable I am with each of these wide receivers, just looking week one in my starting lineup, whether that's on whatever home league platform you're using, just how I would feel with those players in those spots. Like, ideally, I want this player as my wide receiver one. Ideally, I want this player as my wide receiver two, and so on. These tiers are for pretty much any fantasy football league that's half PPR or full PPR, whether that's underdog, your home league, sleeper, ESPN, whatever. And again, roughly half PPR, full PPR. It shouldn't change much between those. And as always, early in the offseason, like we are right now, I feel much stronger about the tier breaks than I do the rankings within each tier. Now, with that being said, our first tier here, 101 candidates. So guys that, if you wanted to take them 101 in your fantasy football draft, I wouldn't really blame you. I wouldn't scoff at you. Right now we have McCaffrey at 101. We just did a video breaking down my top 12. But if you wanted to put CeeDee Lamb there, I wouldn't blame you. Now, we talked about all those players in depth, so I'm not going to go too crazy on the wide receivers we talked about in that video. But CeeDee Lamb, he was the wide receiver one overall last year. He's going to be attached to Dak in an offense that's been top 5 the last couple of years. Mike McCarthy also showed last year that he's going to pass the ball. There's not really any target competition there. So CeeDee Lamb, in the prime of his career, is a great pick after like a 23, 24 point per game season last year in PPR leagues. Then our final wide receiver in this tier, Tyreek Hill. And Tyreek Hill was a monster last year. I had to go back and look through the data, but he came out here and through 13 weeks was at 26.1 points per game. For a wide receiver, that is absurd. He was the highest scoring player in fantasy football by far, and that includes the quarterbacks, the wide receivers, the running backs, everybody. Then he tweaks his ankle in week 12. He leaves early in week 14. He doesn't play in week 15, and it kind of screws up the end of his season. But through 13 weeks, he was a monster. Again, you can see those game logs: 44 in week 1, 30 in week 3, 32 in week 5, 28 in week 6, 25 in week 7. If you had Tyreek Hill, you were almost certainly in the playoff picture last year. Now, he also has some added upside here because last year he had 10 touchdowns in the first half of his games. He had 3 touchdowns in the back half of his games. That was because we saw the Broncos game where they put up like 50-plus points or whatever. They were blowing teams out early on in games because they had a really easy schedule too. They played like the Panthers, they played the Giants, the Chargers early on in the season. But that should change this season. And if we get more competitive game scripts for Tyreek Hill, we get him on the field longer, we get more points. Because last year he was like genuinely trying to break that 2,000-yard receiving record. I imagine that's still on his mind this year. Now we have a new defensive coordinator. We have Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb both out with Achilles and ACL tears. You have Christian Wilkins gone. They're like cornerstone defensive tackle. He goes to the Raiders. So this defense is not what it once was, and that could give us some shootouts here. Now, I will say, there's some chance that he falls off the age cliff at age 30 and his calling card is his like unmatched speed, but he's my wide receiver too. I'm not all that concerned just because he was such a monster last year. He had over 3 yards per out run, is like pretty much the best wide receiver in football by most consensus. Then after that, we have our elite wide receiver ones. These are guys that I still think are difference makers, feel really, really good as your wide receiver one, and project well to hit like 20-plus points per game, but not guys I'm taking at the 101. And first up here is our wide receiver 3. We have Justin Jefferson. Now, I don't know why I'm losing my voice here. I will be honest. I've talked about it in previous videos, but the basement had mold down here. It's almost done getting worked on, but excavating out the mold kicked up a bunch of dust. There's literally dust everywhere. I'm like coughing, and I almost feel like I have allergies. It's the worst, but Here we go. Wide receiver 3, Justin Jefferson. He had a 20-point-per-game season last year despite only playing 5 of his 10 games with Kirk Cousins. He was also fighting through injury. So he's kind of already showed that he can fight through adversity and still give you monstrous production. We can see here, this is a great tweet from Hayden Winks where he says, Justin Jefferson's 4 games post-injury and without Kirk Cousins. So this was like with a mix of Jaron Hall, Dobbs, Mullins, and he was still out here on pace for 187 targets, 128 catches, 2,023 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He's a monster. There's some concern with him not having Kirk Cousins this year, right? You're going to have a mix of Sam Darnold. You're going to have a mix of J.J. McCarthy. But I trust Kevin O'Connell. I trust Justin Jefferson as maybe the best wide receiver in football, and it's tough to put him much lower than this. Now, at wide receiver 4, we have Jamar Chase for the Bengals. And we're now 3 years into his career. He's yet to finish outside of the top 12 wide receivers in points per game. We're just yet to have that like true light the world on fire season for him. But why not in year 4, getting into his prime here? Why not this season, right? Joe Burrow's there. Tyler Boyd's no longer there. Their running game is Zach Moss. They're going to pass the ball. They invest in the offensive line. Not with Orlando Brown. They get on the right side Trent Brown as well. 2 just like massive tackles. This passing offense could just be absolutely bonkers this year, and Jamar Chase could be the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy, but we do have the issue of Joe Burrow has this weird wrist thing going on where he couldn't play last year. We don't have a sample size of any quarterbacks going through that injury, so scares me off ever so slightly, but if you want to have him wide receiver 3, you absolutely can. Now, a player that you could almost talk me into, and I don't know how much it's been just watching the receiver show on Netflix with my mom, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is a guy that you could talk me into as high as wide receiver 3 if you really wanted to. He was a monster last year, despite, you really don't know how much these players are going through. And I will be honest, honestly, every player is fighting through injury during the season. You see in that receiver show where Devontae's dealing with the AC joint sprain going on. You have Jefferson, you have Debo with a hairline fracture. But Amon-Ra St. Brown tore his oblique off the bone. Then he had, it was like foot, mouth, and hand disease or something like that kids get with damn near chicken pox, and he was playing out there. He's an absolute monster. He was fighting through everything last year, and even still, 20-plus points per game, 30% in target share, 10 touchdowns. I don't see why he can't do that again, and I would say his ultimate upside is probably Cooper Kupp in 2021, where he just feasts out of the slot and he gives you 24, 25 points per game. I know in the last video I talked about I had a hard time seeing his upside, but I guess he could add to efficiency. I guess he could add a couple catches here and there, a couple touchdowns here and there, and he could get to that wide receiver 1 overall upside. He has a very similar archetype to Cooper Kupp, so it wouldn't be all that shocking. Now after that we have our wide receiver 1 tier. This is guys that I feel very good as my wide receiver 1. I don't really think you can project them for 20-plus points per game like the elite wide receiver ones, but they still feel super comfortable in that wide receiver 1 slot. And first up, we have A.J. Brown, one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. It just sucks that he's been on low-volume passing offenses. He's never been on an offense that's been inside the top 20 in pass attempts, and that probably doesn't change with Jalen Hurts. But when we look at his entire career, he was 3rd in yards per out run as a rookie, then 3rd, then 8th, then 3rd, then 9th. Career 2.58 yards per out run is a top 10 number in any given year. He is an efficiency freak. He is that guy. And we also now have Kellen Moore in this offense calling plays, who's going to speed up the tempo, is going to be much better than I believe it was Brian Johnson last year, who was pretty terrible. They should go back to the way that they looked in 2022. Should be better, should be more pass attempts, should be more play volume overall. I still do think we're going to get a lot of Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley in close, and I think we're going to get a lot of scrambles on Jalen Hurts dropbacks. But A.J. Brown, he's never had 18-plus points per game. I do think that this year could be that year that he hits 18-plus and flirts with 20 points per game as maybe one of the highest floor wide receivers you can draft in the first round. Then after that, we have Puka Nacua. He's somebody where he feels comfy on my wide receiver 1. He was an absolute monster last year. He didn't break 20 points per game, but most rookies don't. He actually had a rookie year that almost rivaled guys like Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, or actually it did rival them. And those guys then went on in year 2 to have 20-plus point per game seasons, which is what we're hoping for from a wide receiver 1 you draft in the first round. Puka could easily do that. He only had 6 touchdowns last year. If he gets to double digits, he's pretty much a lock to be a 20-plus point per game guy. The only thing in his way is Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp was banged up all last year. How much is that going to affect things? Cooper Kupp coming into this season pretty much fully healthy. Does that lower his ceiling? Does it cap his upside? I do know that the splits with and without Cooper Kupp. I think he was like a 20-plus point per game guy without Cooper Kupp. He was like more like a 15, 16 point per game guy with Kupp. But that's still 15, 16 points per game is still one of the best rookie wide receiver point per game seasons of this, decade. So still really strong numbers there. And I do trust McVay and I do trust Stafford as well. Then we have wide receiver 8. Hopefully everything finally lines up for him. We have Garrett Wilson. He's been amazing on a per-route basis, open score, reception perception, everything you could possibly look at. Garrett Wilson's been a stud. It's just that he has been in probably the worst passing offense through 2 years with Zach Wilson, and last year you had Trevor Siemian and you had Boyle. It's been awful. I'm a Jets fan. You can see the jersey in the background. It's been absolutely terrible. But if he gets Aaron Rodgers and Aaron Rodgers actually plays and Aaron Rodgers' Achilles holds up, it is wheels all the way up for Garrett Wilson. Everything that you've seen on a per-route basis now applies to an actual quarterback in the NFL, a quarterback that should play at a decently high level. And then you also get Nathaniel Hackett, who was the leader in pass rate over expectation last year, inside of the 10-yard line, passing the ball a ton in close, despite having Zach Wilson. We're going to see that again with Aaron Rodgers on a lot of those like Devontae Adams motions on the goal line. And Garrett Wilson is a legitimate threat to lead the NFL in touchdowns. I don't know if any book out there has, wide receiver to lead the league in touchdowns, but if Garrett Wilson is anything longer than like plus 1,000, I might have to sprinkle on that. Now, our next tier, and guys that we finally haven't talked about yet this year, we have our high-end wide receiver 2s. And I know that we're starting with wide receiver 9 as wide receiver 2s. I know usually wide receiver 1s, wide receiver 1 through 12, wide receiver 13 through 24, but the way that you project these guys, it just doesn't feel that way. Whenever I draft these guys in this tier, it just doesn't feel comfy with them in my wide receiver 1 spot. These are guys that I'd much rather have in my wide receiver 2 spots, super, super high-end wide receiver 2s with upside, but guys that I feel a little bit squeamish having as my RB1 or as my wide receiver 1 in my lineup. And we're going to start with Nico Collins. I am considerably higher than consensus on Nico Collins, but for me, what it comes down to is he has the best combination of being a very good player, being a really good bet to lead his team in targets, and being on a really good offense. That all comes together here. And even though maybe he doesn't have like wide receiver 1 overall upside and there's some target competition in Houston, I just want to bet on the guy that last year was just an absolute monster. He finished as the wide receiver 7 in points per game at 17.4 PPR points. So at the wide receiver 9, to me, that's pretty much fine. Again, I get that they add Stephon Diggs. You're going to have Tank Dell this year, but he actually averaged 18.2 points per game with Tank Dell, 15.7 without Tank Dell. So he actually played off of Tank Dell really well. And to me, Nico Collins is your set-in-stone ex-perimeter wide receiver, whereas you're going to have more of Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs playing that slot flanker type of role and dueling with each other to be out there in 3 wide receiver sets or be the primary slot flanker type of player. To me, Nico Collins doesn't get affected as much as they do against each other. And then with Nico Collins, he was an absolute monster last year. Jacob Gibbs has a great tweet here. Over the past 10 seasons, there's been 8 wide receivers who have run 300 or more routes, averaged 3 or more yards per route run. In 2023, Nico Collins was the youngest wide receiver to do it on this list. And it's a list with Nico Collins, Brandon Ayuk, Julio Jones 3 times, Tyreek Hill twice, and Cooper Kupp. The kind of efficiency you need to hit 3+ yards per route run on 300 routes is just absolute madness. Now, we get CJ Stroud. Again, I understand the target competition, but they didn't have that many pass attempts last year, and they didn't have that many passing touchdowns, really just because CJ Stroud was a rookie. They're going to pass the ball more in CJ Stroud's second year. He's no longer a rookie, and he should see more touchdowns than he did last year. So when you take that into account, I get that there is added target competition, but there's going to be much more for everybody to eat. And this could be an offense where CJ Stroud goes out there, lights the world on fire, kind of like Mahomes in his first year as a true starter. We had like 50 touchdowns and 5,000 yards. I'm not saying this is the expected outcome, but there's truly a ceiling outcome where Stroud wins MVP, throws for 40 touchdowns, passes for 4,500 yards, and like 2 of these Texans wide receivers absolutely crush. So I'm fine taking Nico Collins anywhere like the early second, to be honest with you. Then after that, we have our wide receiver 10, Marvin Harrison Jr. And I know that this feels really high for a rookie wide receiver, but I was actually shocked. ESPN right now, which is like, this is where most home leagues are at. He's the wide receiver 10 on there, wide receiver 9 on Sleeper as well. So this isn't just like an underdog thing. Everybody seems to be all in on Marvin Harrison Jr., and that makes me feel a little bit better, right? Because even your home league drafters are taking Marvin Harrison Jr. very high. He is a one of the best wide receiver prospects we've seen since Jamar Chase. And this range of wide receivers, like this tier, is tough. This is that range where you go on underdog, you get in the second round, and nothing on the board feels remotely good at all. Everything feels like a reach, and that's why I'm fine putting him here, even though he's a rookie, and that's a bit concerning. Everybody has their warts in this range, so I'm fine betting on the generational talent. And he's actually projected right now on Mike Clay's projections. He works over at ESPN as the wide receiver 13. And the reason why I bring that up, even though I have him at wide receiver 10, Clay has him wide receiver 13, it's that this were his rookie projections last year. He didn't have a single rookie wide receiver inside of the top 40. He's very, very conservative, especially when it comes to rookie wide receivers. So him having Marvin Harrison Jr. as wide receiver 13, despite being in a lower volume passing offense, despite being next to Trey McBride, is massive. He still found the way to get Marvin Harrison Jr. flirting with wide receiver 1 numbers. And to me, because he's so conservative, as you can see from like JSN's projection, Jordan Addison, all of that, he's so conservative with rookies that almost feels like his floor is wide receiver 13 in an offense with Kyler Murray. He has the ceiling of a Puka, Jefferson, Chase rookie season, and those guys had Stafford, Burrow, Kirk Cousins. To me, Kyler Murray is in the same tier of quarterback as those guys. So it wouldn't be all that crazy if he had a ton of efficiency because he's more of that downfield wide receiver. He's a big target, could get involved in the end zone. He could absolutely crush this year, and I'm fine taking him anywhere in the second round. Then we have our wide receiver 11. We have Drake London. My bad for like taking a while to find these guys. I get them lost down here at the bottom of this website. But Drake London for the Falcons, wide receiver 11. Again, everyone in this tier has their warts. Marvin Harrison Jr. is a rookie. Nico Collins has all the target competition in the world. Drake London has never even finished inside of the top 40 wide receivers in points per game, and you have to take him in the top 12 this year. But he's been in brutal offenses with Arthur Smith and Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke and Marcus Mariota. It has been absolutely brutal. But on a per route basis, similar to Garrett Wilson, he has been a monster. Last year, not as great when we look at receiving grade, first downs per out run, targets per out run, yards per out run. The reason we care about these is receiving grade is like on film, does he look good? First downs per out run, are you moving the chains on your offense? Are you an engine for good plays? Targets per out run, are you commanding volume? Yards per out run, are you being efficient? And in 2023, he was fine. He was like 27th in receiving grade, 26th in first downs per out run, 32nd in targets per out run, 34th in yards per out run. Just a down year efficiency-wise, but again, this Falcons offense was brutal. But as a true rookie, he was a monster. If you plug his numbers as a rookie into last year, he would have been 12th in receiving grade, higher receiving grade than rookie year Puka Nacua. He was 11th in first downs per out run. Like his per route numbers almost go toe to toe with Puka besides the yards per out run thing. And you can kind of attribute that to quarterback play, but receiving grade, amazing. First downs per out run, top 12. Targets per out run, 6th. Yards per out run, 20th, and again, in a bad passing offense. So if you can find somewhere between rookie year numbers and last year's numbers, and you put those together, and now you have an offense with Kirk Cousins, and you have new offense coordinator Zach Robinson, who comes from the Rams, and should pass the ball much more and be much more balanced and up-tempo than you saw with Arthur Smith, that's all really exciting. Now, I have a tough time putting it much higher than this because, again, we haven't seen it before, and there is truly the downside that Kirk Cousins off the Achilles is bad, and then if Michael Penix comes in, he's a rookie quarterback, which also isn't great. So there's certainly a lot of downside, and the projection for this Falcons offense does feel fragile with Kirk Cousins off the Achilles. Because, again, we don't really know what it looks like. It's going to be a very interesting case study with Rodgers and Kirk Cousins this year, but we do not know a quarterback coming back year one from Achilles, how that's going to look. We shall see this year. Now, another wide receiver, again, all these guys have their own question marks. We have Chris Olave here, wide receiver 12. And he's so tough, man. He is a per-route god. If we look at this London chart, you can see last year Chris Olave was 18th in receiving grade, 14th in first downs per out run, 16th in targets per out run, 21st in yards per out run, above 2 yards per out run each of his last 2 years, wide receiver 25 in points per game as a rookie, wide receiver 19 in points per game last year. All really good, but we have him at wide receiver 12, right? And he has a very high floor. He's going to finish as a wide receiver 2 again, but him being like a meaningful wide receiver 1 is so tough to project when you bring in Clint Kubiak, who's going to want to run the ball, chew the clock. The Saints, weirdly, last year, are actually an up-tempo team. That's going to slow down. You have Derek Carr, who's not a good quarterback. Behind him is a rookie, Spencer Rattler. So there's not a lot of target competition. Chris Olave is a really talented player, but this environment is just brutal. And it's why I prefer a guy like Nico Collins, because I'd rather have competition in a high-scoring offense than be the only guy in a low-scoring offense, because it just reminds me a lot of early career DJ Moore, who had his years here and there, but never like a smash season until he got to Chicago. I think that's what we're dealing with Olave, but when you do his projections in terms of his per route stuff and the way that wide receivers kind of really hit their peak in year 3, it's tough to put Olave much lower just based on what he's done through 2 years so far. Then we have Jalen Waddle, and wide receiver 13 feels really high for a wide receiver 2 in his own offense, right behind Tyreek Hill. He has no shot at outscoring Tyreek Hill. You know, there's a couple of these guys like in years past, before we knew Jamar Chase was Jamar Chase, or like, oh, well, maybe T. Higgins can outscore Jamar Chase, or maybe Jalen Waddle can outscore Tyreek Hill. There's simply no way unless if Tyreek Hill got hurt. But in a tier that's kind of yucky, he is a very, very strong bet to finish as a wide receiver 2. Last year, you kind of have to throw out. It was one of his worst years last year, and he just left so many games early. He had a high ankle sprain, he had a bruised chest, knee soreness, back soreness, concussion, and up until this point, he played every single game his first 2 years in Miami. Just a really, really unlucky year. And even despite leaving games early and not playing at 100%, his per route stuff last year was beautiful. 5th in receiving grade with a 90-plus receiving grade. He was 7th in first downs per route run, 6th in targets per route run, 7th in yards per route run. So the efficiency there, even despite running routes like to Tyreek Hill, having a 27% target per route run, bonkers. So he's commanding wide receiver 1 volume. He's being efficient like a wide receiver 1. Everything grades out like a wide receiver 1. He's just behind Tyreek Hill, but Mike McDaniel, the last 2 years since he got Tyreek Hill, has been top 5 in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And then you also have an offense where everything's consolidated. There's not really a clear wide receiver 3. I know Jonnu Smith is there, but he's not really a real threat. The targets are going to be consolidated at the top with Waddle and Tyreek Hill, and Waddle can still hit back-end wide receiver 1 numbers in this offense. And then you also get the added upside of if Tyreek Hill gets hurt again this year or he falls off an age cliff, then any game that Tyreek Hill misses, Jalen Waddle is an absolute monster. I believe the only game that he's played without Tyreek, he had like 28 points per game, but just in this environment with those per route numbers in a really good passing offense, Jalen Waddle would be a wide receiver 1 in any game that Tyreek Hill missed. Then we have, I believe this is the last wide receiver of this tier. And admittedly, before this week, Ayuk I had much higher, or not much higher, but probably ahead of Olave and Waddle. But we're going to put him here. I want to put him at the back end of this tier because there's so much uncertainty around Ayuk right now that it makes me a little bit squeamish, right? You have him requesting a trade, which is interesting because right now the way that things are set up, he's not incentivized to sit out. He's going to have to pay really hefty fines. The 49ers have him on his 5th-year option and then can tag him next year, so they're not really under a lot of pressure to trade him. But you do have the downside risk of the JT thing last year where JT sat out and was like on the pup but wasn't really hurt. You could definitely see that with Ayuk where he just wants to protect himself this year so he can get paid after his 5th-year option. But again, he's still liable to get tagged. So it's a very small % chance, and we'll move him down as we see fit depending on what the 49ers do or if we get reports that he's going to sit out or hold out or whatever. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For now, I'll have him at the back end of this tier. But we talk about Ayuk, the player. He's a monster. Last year, he's pretty much maxed out efficiency-wise, and why I can't put him much higher than this. On the 49ers last year, he was the wide receiver 44 in expected points per game. So just based on your targets, your red zone targets, how many points should you have scored? He should have been the wide receiver 44 last year. Instead, he had the second highest fantasy points over expected. So based on your volume, what are you doing more than that? And it ended up putting him at wide receiver 15 in points per game. So he was wide receiver 44 in volume, wide receiver 15 in points per game. And that's just because he's so good. We've seen the Matt Harmon reception perception charts. He's a monster. He breaks everything. Reception perception, ESPN open score, yards per run, anything you want to look at. I mean, I can pull up the yards per run thing again. You can see at the top, Ayuk, 2nd in receiving grade, 3rd in first downs per run. Even on the 28 targets per run, still 3rd in yards per run. He is just a monster efficiency-wise, and I'm not going to bet on that regressing because he is a very good player in the prime of his career. And then I will say on streams, I might have said something on the lines of like if Ayuk gets traded, that's not great. But I have been opened up to the idea a little bit that it might be a good thing if he was to get traded, even if it was a bad team like the Patriots or Washington, anywhere where he could get more volume than the wide receiver 44 in expected points per game, that raises his ceiling. Because if he can capture that crazy efficiency on like wide receiver 24 in expected points per game, we're talking about a guy that can finish top 12 very easily, and he fits this criteria that Dynasty IM laid out here Wide receivers to post 1,200 plus yards on an offense that throws less than 30 pass attempts per game. You have Ayuk, Mike Wallace, Brandon Marshall, Des Bryant. You have to be very, very good to do this. And if we can get to a situation where they pass the ball more and there's less target competition, then we're talking about a massive, massive year for Brandon Ayuk. Now, after that, we have the wide receiver 2 tier. These are guys where I just feel good about them in my wide receiver 2 spot. I don't really want them as my wide receiver 1, maybe in like double hero or B builds. You could talk me into it. But first up, we'll have Deebo Samuel. Now, he's not much dissimilar than Brandon Ayuk. He actually outscored Brandon Ayuk in points per game. I feel like people kind of forget that, but he has a couple of things working for him and against him. I would say the things that are working against him is he doesn't win as traditionally as Ayuk. So it's tough to project his efficiency year over year, where a lot of it is on carries. I believe that he's tied for the most. Warren Sharp put this out a few weeks ago. He's tied for the most rushing touchdowns from the 10-yard line or further back. So like non-goal line touchdowns. He's tied for the lead in that despite not being a running back, which is crazy. I think it's like him and Derrick Henry or like him and McCaffrey at the top of the list. He's a monster. But that's a lot of efficiency. To score touchdowns from further out than 10 yards where you're not expected to score touchdowns, especially as a wide receiver, it's tough. And that's what we saw in 2022 when he was the wide receiver 28 in points per game. He bounces back last year to like the wide receiver 12. In 2021, when he was like a true monster, he was the wide receiver 2 in points per game. So there's a lot of variance with that efficiency because he's not going to have a lot of volume like Ayuk, and he doesn't win with the wide receiver stuff where, you know, it's really easy to replicate what Ayuk did last year. You just have to beat players downfield, run good routes. Deebo, it's a little bit different. You have to stay healthy. You have to play a little bit of running back. Things have to break your way. But again, he was dealing with injuries last year. He had the hairline fracture and still finished as the wide receiver 12. He's going to be in a good offense. And he has the upside that if Ayuk leaves town, Deebo probably gets bumped up a tier, and you can project him as like a top 12 wide receiver. So Deebo's still Deebo. He's in a good offense. It's tough to put him much lower than this. Then we have Davante Adams, who makes me really squeamish to draft, man. It feels a lot like our favorite wide receivers growing up. You know, the age cliff is coming for Davante Adams. As much as I hate to say it, he's like 32 at this point. Last year, even despite terrible quarterback play, you saw the wide receiver 15 in points per game. So, like, I can put him at wide receiver 16, but I don't love the idea of drafting him again. It could just be frustrating again where the quarterback sucks. I know that he has Gardner Minshew, who had Michael Pittman last year. Maybe it'll be similar to the way that Michael Pittman was used last year. You do have the upside of Luke Getsy, the offensive coordinator, coming in. He just came off of a year with DJ Moore where he fed him like 28% of the targets. He was on the Packers staff when Davante Adams had some of those big years, so he should get peppered with volume again. It's just going to be inefficient volume, which is going to be frustrating. He needs to be the Davante Adams we know to flirt with wide receiver 1 numbers, or he could be this bust at ADP where the offense sucks and it's frustrating the entire year. We'll see how things go. The volume should be there, though. He was at a 29% target per route run number last year behind just Tyreek Hill. So the volume should be there. My biggest concern is touchdowns and efficiency. We'll see if it can follow him. Then we have Mike Evans, who, if you want to put ahead of Davante Adams, you absolutely can. For right now, this is just more of a feel thing, but the only concern I have with Mike Evans is not Mike Evans, or I guess it's like a little bit of his age, but I'm done betting against Mike Evans not hitting 1,000 receiving yards. It's happened in 10 straight years. He's coming off wide receiver 10, 13, 10, and 5 wide receiver finishes. I'm at wide receiver 17, which is behind all of that. So this is like a decent price for me where it bakes in the downside of his age. It bakes in the downside. My biggest thing that I'm concerned about is Dave Canales leaving and Baker having to replicate what he did last year. Baker doing what he did last year, he maybe only did once in Cleveland, like as a rookie, where he was actually like a good passing game quarterback. Things clicked with Mike Evans. It could just click again, but it could also be a shit show without Dave Canales. That's pretty much the biggest downside with this offense. That makes me a little bit hesitant to push Mike Evans much higher up than this. Then at wide receiver 18, we have DJ Moore. Now, despite the Bears ranking 5th in pass attempts, they were 5th worst in pass attempts, 6th worst in passing yards, and they scored less than 20 passing touchdowns last year. DJ Moore still set career highs in points per game, touchdowns, receiving yards, receptions, receiving grade, yards per out run last year. He was a monster. Despite his quarterbacks being Justin Fields and Tyson Bagent, his stat line last year, I think that we don't appreciate it enough. 96 for 1,364 yards and 8 touchdowns as the wide receiver 9 in points per game, again, with brutal quarterback play. And we are getting all the discount in the world. He was wide receiver 9 last year. You can draft him in the teens. This is the lowest I can put DJ Moore. I get it. You have added competition where Keenan Allen comes in, Roma Dunze comes in. You have a rookie quarterback. But Caleb Williams rookie quarterback for the Bears is the best prospect we've seen since Trevor Lawrence. Now, I know Trevor Lawrence wasn't great, but he does have the upside to be a C.J. Stroud, a Justin Herbert, a Andrew Luck, Joe Burrow, where he is a really good rookie quarterback. And then if not, he still has like the baseline expectation of being a fine rookie quarterback, and he has a monstrous situation where all the passing options are there. They invested in the offensive line, and this offense is going to be much better under the guidelines of Shane Waldron this year, where in Seattle's offense from 2021 to 2023, when Shane Waldron was there, he was also the guy that revived Geno Smith's career. He was 10th in EPA per play, so that's just offensive efficiency, 7th in rush efficiency, 12th in passing efficiency, 13th in success rate, 10th in neutral pass rate, tied for 5th in neutral pace. So pace means he's going to run up-tempo, no huddle. They're going to have a lot of plays. They're going to pass the ball. They're going to be efficient when they pass the ball. And that's all really good for DJ Moore, which in his entire career, he has not had a setup like that with passing efficiency and up-tempo and a good offense. And if that comes here, it's very similar to the Nico Collins thing of, I get the target competition is there, but I'm bullish on this passing offense being better than expected. And if DJ Moore's a number one in a Shane Waldron passing attack that's actually much better than people think, right? If we see a CJ Stroud season or a Justin Herbert season out of Caleb Williams, then DJ Moore could absolutely crush and finish in the top 12 this year. Then at wide receiver 19, we have DK Metcalf, who loses Shane Waldron, right? Shane Waldron goes to the Bears, but Pete Carroll's gone, right? The Seahawks, despite having Shane Waldron, who runs no huddle and wants to get up-tempo, it was partly because their defense couldn't get off the field, and it was partly because they had bad third down luck, and Geno Smith was banged up last year, but they had the lowest offensive plays per game last year. They bring in new offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, and he is very exciting. Where these are the 2 years that he was with Washington, you can see plays per game was about league average in 2023. Before that was top 10. So he wants to get up-tempo, somewhere between league average and top of the league, and then was just a monster. Top 10 in efficiency per play, per game, and his passing efficiency was really his calling card at Washington, which is exciting for DK Metcalf because DK Metcalf hasn't had that truly dominant season since his second year in the NFL, where you can see here, EP per game is your expected points, FPOE is fantasy points over expected. His second year, wide receiver 16 in expected points per game, 10th in FPOE per game. That's how you hit a monstrous season. Then, since then, he's had tough seasons where in his third year, he actually had a top 24 efficiency season, but he was after the top 24 in volume. Then in year 4, he was 14th in volume, but outside the top 200 in efficiency. Last year, he was decent at both, but if we can get like top 15 in volume and top 15 in efficiency, DK Metcalf can finish as a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. And I like the idea that we get Geno Smith, who's going to be fully healthy this year. You get a new OC who wants to run like a high-flying passing attack, and you have JSN, who can definitely blossom into a good receiver, but he's going to operate out of the slot in the intermediate areas of the field. You have Tyler Lockett, who's an aging field stretcher. Now you have DK Metcalf as like a true X, stud, true alpha of this passing offense. And if he can give you, right, a ton of efficiency from operating downfield, lead this team in targets, and hit like 10-plus touchdowns in a revamped passing offense, we're, again, talking about DK Metcalf as like a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy, something we haven't seen since his rookie year. And I think as well he's had a decent floor where he's had 4 straight seasons of top 24 point per game finishes. So you have the floor and you have the ceiling with Metcalf. Someone I'm actually much more excited about than I was heading into the season. Now, this is where we get into like the senior citizen part of this tier. And I'm coming around on Cooper Kupp, man. He wasn't somebody I was drafting a lot of, but he's tough because he has a similar issue to Devontae Adams of the age cliff is coming for Cooper Kupp. He's going to be like 31, 32 years old, and he could fall off a cliff, take a complete backseat to Puka Nacua, and tank teams this year. But we now have a guy that has had back-to-back years plagued by injury, which could signal him falling off, but he could come back to full health and be better. Last year was the wide receiver 23 in points per game. Before that, he was the wide receiver 1 in points per game, despite only playing like 9 games. And if you kind of connect those 2 seasons and sort of average them together, he would still end up as like a wide receiver 1, back-end wide receiver 1, like 18, 17 point per game guy, which I think would be a smash in like the 3rd, 4th round. You can get Cooper Kupp, and then also any game that Puka Nacua doesn't play, he could be a top 5 wide receiver in points per game. I heard Hayden Winks bring it up the other day, but it's a great point too in terms of like redraft home league trade value, where if Cooper Kupp comes out in week 1 and gives you like 20 points on 10 targets and some yak, he could very easily, like that following week when I'm talking about like rest of season rankings or like lessons learned from week 1 of the fantasy football season, he could be somebody that instantly after week 1 is like a top 6 wide receiver rest of season. That's not all that crazy to think. So he's exciting. I also really like the environment of the Rams this year where, of course, McVay, Stafford, they're all there, but this defense now doesn't have Aaron Donald. So this is a team that actually has like a bad defense. I couldn't name you a single one of their corners. I know that they have a couple of young guys, or they have like they have Bryce Young on the edge. They got I don't know if I think his name's Kobe Turner inside, but we're not talking about like true stud difference makers. I know they drafted the kid out of FSU, but it's going to be a bad defense. Without Aaron Donald, it's going to struggle, and that could get the Rams into a lot of shootouts and provide volume enough for Puka and Cooper Kupp in that offense. Then, I told you, we're going to have some old players. Stephon Diggs. I have every Houston Texans wide receiver ranked at the top 24. Again, I truly do think that the upside here is C.J. Stroud MVP season, 40-plus passing touchdowns, 4,500-plus passing yards, and everybody, 2 out of 3 of these wide receivers get home. And I want to swing and miss on them. It's that simple, because the most frustrating thing in the world is when you get a guy like Deontay Johnson in years past or DJ Moore in years past, where they get all the volume in the world, but there's no touchdowns, there's no offensive efficiency, and they suck. I'd rather wide receivers in a good passing offense. We could see a monstrous step forward for CJ Stroud. And Diggs, I think the idea that he declined last year is probably a little bit overstated. He was really good to start the season. And I feel like we don't see that. Like, I think he had 6 straight games to start the season of 100-plus receiving yards. Are you really going to tell me that from week 7 on, he truly declined? I could see, after an entire offseason, you come into the year and you're just not the same guy. We've seen that with Allen Robinson in the past, right? But the idea that, he was still in the prime of his career through 6 weeks and then all of a sudden wasn't is tough for me to conceptualize. This was still a guy that had a 28% target share last year, was commanding volume, was efficient early on in the year, and then they fired their offensive coordinator. They had to learn, a new playbook with new tendencies, and they really focused on running the ball. So he was still getting his per pass attempt volume, but the overall passing volume went down. There should be much more passing volume than there was back end of the season with the Bills last year, on the Texans this year, with C.J. Stroud. And Dwayne McFarland, shout out Dwayne McFarland over at Fantasy Life. And again, Stephon Diggs was the wide receiver 13 in points per game last year. So again, I have a tough time saying that he fell off. And a guy that's been a first-round fantasy pick the last 3 years, you can now get in the 3rd round. Sign me up, because again, I don't think that it's all that clear that he fell off or isn't that good anymore. And Dwayne McFarland outlined it really well. He actually made an article very recently talking through wide receivers falling off the age cliff. And he looked through kind of the factors of why that is, why wide receivers falter. And he looked through the Stephon Diggs, and he said there really isn't much here. He said Diggs has delivered 4 consecutive wide receiver 1 finishes, but his ADP is falling. He'll face more competition from younger targets like Collins and Dell, but there's a chance he's the guy to roster in an ascending passing attack with a big-time young quarterback. The veteran wide receiver's fantasy production faltered in the second half of 2023, averaging only 9.6 points per game, but he retained his 28% target share. However, the Bills moved to a run-first offense under Joe Brady with a -3 drop back over expected rate, a significant factor. So they lowered the volume, but he still had a massive piece of the pie. Then Diggs' yards per route run against man coverage dipped below 2 for the second time in the last 3 seasons, which is a concern. However, the last time he rebounded back up to a 2.65. So the last time he had a down year, I believe that was 2021 in Buffalo. I'm trying to think. I believe that was 2021 in Buffalo, and then he bounces back in 2022. Now, we can see that again here. He said, while Diggs' profile isn't perfect, his PPR per game numbers are strong, and his low-end wide receiver 2 price tag is where I want exposure, slightly above or even with the market. I can't tell you who will lead this Texans passing attack, but I won't be surprised if it's Diggs, so I want share of all the pieces. And that's kind of where I'm at as well. I'm much more confident in Nico Collins being the lead guy, just as being the entrenched X-wide receiver. I think Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell are the ones that are negatively correlated. I wouldn't want both of them on the same team, Diggs and Dell, but Diggs is going to have every opportunity to be there, earn his keep in year 1. They traded for him. He wants to ball out, so I'm completely fine with Stephon Diggs in that 3rd, 4th round area. Then we get our high-end wide receiver 3. So these are guys, they're luxury wide receiver 3s. I know that this is, again, they're not matched up completely, but I'm not just going to section them by wide receiver 12 through, wide receiver 1 through 12, wide receiver 13 through 24. It's more just feelings based on their projections. And Tank Dell is somebody just with the uncertainty of the injury and him coming off of a shortened rookie year and then having 2 other wide receivers to compete with. A little squeamish to have him as my true wide receiver 2, but he is the perfect upside wide receiver 3, upside flex play that could just be an absolute monster this year. And again, point blank, I just want pieces of this Texans offense. They were top 12 in pass attempts last year and yards, but They were outside the top 10 in passing touchdowns. We could see more touchdowns. We could see more attempts, more yards, all of that stuff. And I don't want to overthink Tank Dell. Again, same thing. You can get the guys where they have no target competition, but they're in an offense where the offense is going to suck, and there's not going to be touchdowns. They're not going to sustain drives. That's not going to happen with the Texans. That's why I want to bet on these guys. And all of them, to me, are good bets. Where you can see last year, Tank Dell, 15th in receiving grade, 16th in first downs per out run, 25th in targets per out run, 17th in yards per out run. For a rookie, those are bonkers numbers. And then Diggs last year, again, like we just talked about, like not that bad. Still 80-plus receiving grade, still 20th in first downs per out run, 7th in targets per out run, 28th in yards per out run, just a hair under 2 yards per out run. So still just fine in my eyes. Then we could see year 2, breakout potential for Tank Dell. Those PFF receiving grade numbers are no joke. The numbers he put up are no joke. And damn, do I not have this graphic ready to go? Another tweet from Dynasty IM that was really good. I should have it. Is this it? Yeah. Okay. So you can see here. Whoa. Hate to see that. You can see with Tank Dell here, this is a really good tweet from Dynasty IM. There's been 10 rookie wide receivers to post 14-plus points per game and 80-plus PFF receiving grade. 8 of them have posted a wide receiver 1 season. 7 of them have posted multiple wide receiver 1 season. 6 of them have posted a top 5 season. This is a Tank Dell tweet. Now, 10 rookie wide receivers, Tank Dell one of them. So 9 receivers. Of them, only 8 have put up a wide receiver 1 season. He follows up this tweet. The one wide receiver who didn't get a wide receiver 1 season, Brandon Ayuk. The one other wide receiver who didn't have multiple wide receiver 1 seasons, Puka Nacua, who was a rookie wide receiver last year. So really, really, really strong company in terms of his PFF grade, in terms of his points per game last year. And I just want to bet on him, even if the projections don't make sense, just with target competition in Houston. But next up, we have Malik Neighbors. And I've cooled off on Malik Neighbors. He is one of my favorite wide receiver prospects ever. Him and Marvin Harrison Jr., best wide receiver prospects we've seen since Jamar Chase. He could be the next Jamar Chase, but like we said earlier, Jamar Chase had Joe Burrow. Jefferson had Kirk Cousins. Puka had Stafford. Malik Neighbors has Daniel Jones coming off of an ACL tear. A Daniel Jones who hasn't hit 20-plus passing touchdowns since his rookie year. And you guys know, and I always say with rookie wide receivers is this. I say, well, the reason you draft rookie wide receivers is because they get more productive as the year goes on. So Malik Neighbors might project worse than the guys in this range, but from weeks 10 on, he might be the wide receiver 5 in points per game and be the guy that you need, right? You can see here on this chart from Jack Miller and from Michael Dubner that rookies go up and veterans go down as the season goes on. But Jack Miller actually revisited this graph a couple of weeks back, and this is a great tweet from Sam Sherman. I won't read it all, but I'll actually just show the chart. And pretty much what it says is that wide receivers taken early that were already projecting for huge roles, they don't actually get more productive as the season goes on. It's those late season hammers, right? In years past where last year was Rashee Rice and Jaden Reed, 2 guys you drafted outside of the top 10 rounds. Before that, it was Christian Watson, who you drafted outside the top 10 rounds. Then Amon-Ra St. Brown, same deal. So it's tough to be like, well, this applies to Malik Neighbors, who is going to be the wide receiver 1 in week 1, is going to play all the routes in week 1. So there's not this upside of like him getting more routes and getting on the field, and he's already going to be that guy from week 1. So I have a hard time saying that he's going to backload his fantasy points. So it's something that I'm staying away from, especially with these early rookie wide receivers. It is in bad faith to say, well, Malik Neighbors might start slow, but he could pick things up. Well, why? He's not going to run more routes. I guess you could say he'll learn the game of the NFL, but like we saw with Puka Nacua as early as week 1. We saw as early as week 1 with a lot of these high-end guys like Jefferson and Chase. They're good right out the gate. They don't, add things on in the back. It's really more of your fringy guys who get on the field and get in the wide receiver rotation that end up doing that. Now, the reason why, he's my wide receiver 23. He's like wide receiver 20 on Underdog, so I'm not all that low on him, but he's going in like the late second on Underdog sometimes, which, by the way, if you want to exploit those ADPs, make sure you check out Underdog Fantasy. They have the best drafts in the game. They have I believe the Fast Puppies out right now where it's $5 to enter, $100,000 to first place. You have the Pick'ems on there, and when you use promo code RON, they will match your first deposit up to $250. It's a great way to get ready for your home league where you hop on there, you run some drafts, and you see, well, oh man, Malik Neighbors is going in the late second, but you get to your home league draft where Malik Neighbors is going at the 4 or 5 turn, and you look up, you're in the 4th round, Malik Neighbors is still on the board, and you're like, whoa, he shouldn't be here. And you can kind of get accustomed to what efficient, sharp drafts look like, and then use that to leverage them in your home league and get a feel for where you can exploit your edges. Again, promo code RON, you can find that in the link and in the description. Click the link. It'll take you to Underdog Fantasy. It'll use promo code RON. It'll match your first deposit up to $250. Now, when we talk about why Neighbors is a little bit rougher and why I'm putting him a little bit lower. He's like wide receiver 18. That's where he was at before this for me. I moved him down about 5 spots, and it's why I wanted to do this video, so I can dig into the numbers and, you know, not just make rankings based on vibes, but do it based on research. And when you look at Malik Neighbors, I broke down legendary wide receiver prospects. So these are the best wide receiver prospects in my prospect model, and then also any elite wide receivers who are also top 10 picks. So maybe they fell through the cracks of the model, but top 10 picks who can ball out early. And this is your entire list. Now, I took Malik Neighbors' projections from Mike Clay for his points per game, his targets per game, pass attempts per game, pass yards, and pass touchdowns. So I just wanted to know, what volume do you need and what passing environment do you need to truly pay off? Last year, wide receiver 20 in points per game, his ADP on Underdog was 14.5 points per game. He's projected for 14.3, which is fine, but I have a hard time seeing what his ceiling ends up looking like. His like Jamar Chase, OBJ, Justin Jefferson, Mike Evans type of season. I mean, maybe he's Mike Evans, but probably not. The issue is that the environment is brutal. You have Daniel Jones there. Like, Malik Neighbors, to me, just profiles as a guy like we talked about with DJ Moore and Deontay Johnson, where he's going to have like 6 catches for 70 yards, and it's not going to be fun. I know he's probably more efficient than that, but they're not going to sustain drives. They're not going to score a ton of touchdowns. This is not the best offense in the world. I know he's going to be the only target, but it'll be more in this, not gadget, but it'll be like low A-dot slot, manufactured touches role, and I just don't know. Like, I think it's going to be kind of like what Zay Flowers was last year. I'm more comfortable having him towards the back end of that third round, like over where Zay Flowers is on Underdog, but the 2-3 turn, it just feels a little bit rich because for him to pay off, this offense needs to be good, and they need to score passing touchdowns, right, where he can be Daniel Jones' red zone target. The issue is that, number one, Daniel Jones is a scrambling quarterback, so in close, he's going to run the ball in a good chunk of the time. And then also, as much as I praise Brian Daboll, I was surprised to see these numbers. Over his 10-year coaching career of being an offensive coordinator or a head coach, he has only been top half of the league in passing touchdowns twice in those 10 years, and they both came with Josh Allen. So I don't know how this offense scores enough passing touchdowns and has an environment for him to succeed as a rookie. I think it could be frustrating in year one, and he breaks out later down the line. Now, again, in like your home leagues, in like the 4th round when he's there, I'm completely fine with it. But in these sharper underdog leagues, whatever, wide receiver heavy leagues where he's a late second, really early third, I have a tough time pressing the button myself. Now, after that, we have Devontae Adams at wide receiver, or not Devontae Adams, Devontae Smith at wide receiver 24. And if you want to have him, you know, higher than this, you absolutely can. To me, he's like just a just fine wide receiver 2. He's had back-to-back top 24 point per game finishes. I just have a tough time seeing how he crushes and is like a top 6 wide receiver in points per game. And I'd like that upside, right? I would like league-winning upside when I'm drafting these guys. He's not going to beat out A.J. Brown. Even with Kellen Moore, they're not going to be top 20 in pass attempts. So everything, in terms of upside, it's all for A.J. Brown. It's not for Devontae Smith. Again, with Kellen Moore, the pace should go up. It should be a better passing offense. And I think that he could, right? Like I believe his second year last year, 2022, he was like the wide receiver 14, wide receiver 15 in points per game. He can certainly hit that. I just have a tough time seeing how he gets like 17 plus points per game and it's like a league winner where you're drafting him. But he's a fine pick as your wide receiver, 3. Then we have T. Higgins, who everything hinges on Joe Burrow's health. Again, the wrist injury really scares me. It really spooks me, but this is about as low as I can put T. Higgins. He is coming off a bad year. He fractured his ribs. He had a hamstring in week 10. He was just brutal last year. He set career lows in yards per out run, points per game, yards, pretty much everything. But in his 46 career games with Joe Burrow, he's averaged 14.1 points per game, which would have been the wide receiver 24 last year. He has the upside to flirt with top 12 numbers, similar to Devontae Smith, where he can give you that like wide receiver 14, 13 finish. He did it in 2021 with Joe Burrow, despite being next to Jamar Chase that year. But just like Devontae Smith, because he's behind Jamar Chase, the true league-breaking upside is not really there. But I will say he is one of these guys like Devontae Smith, like Jalen Waddle, with like contingent upside, where if Jamar Chase was to go down, T. Higgins could be a top 12 wide receiver from there on after. So you do always have to factor in that upside. Then we have Michael Pittman, who is such a tough one, man. He has finished as a top 24 wide receiver in points per game each of the last 3 years, and yet I have him as wide receiver 26. And the biggest holdup for me is that his top 24 finishes have come with pocket quarterbacks. You had Gardner Minshew, you had Matt Ryan, and you had late career Carson Wentz, who wasn't scrambling much. But you now get Anthony Richardson. Michael Pittman last year had 109 catches, only 4 passing touchdowns. That is the epitome of, like, that's pretty much Jarvis Landry. Michael Pittman's career ADOT is 8.6. Jarvis Landry's was 8.1 in his career. So for being a bigger wide receiver, he's much more of, like, he's this big slot, low ADOT, which is kind of brutal. I don't see how he hits his upside because we've seen Shane Steichen in 2021 with the Eagles. I believe both Miles Sanders and Jalen Hurts were top 5 in rush attempts inside of the 10-yard line. I think we're going to see the same thing with Richardson and JT. So the touchdown upside isn't there. We saw last year splits with and without Anthony Richardson. Pittman was a 13-point per game guy with Richardson, 16.7 point per game guy without him, which 16.7 is like back-end wide receiver 1 numbers. 13 points per game is like fringy wide receiver 2, which is where I have him at this point. You also have the idea, again, of that 8.6 yard ADOT. Richardson is more of a chuck the ball downfield type of guy. He's going to scramble instead of dump things off. You also have added competition of A.D. Mitchell. So we're going to see less volume. You're going to see limited touchdown upside. You have more target competition. Maybe Josh Downs comes into his own. So it's just tough for me to put him much higher than this, but I do get that he was really good last year. And he could catch 100 balls again. I just think with Richardson, it's a little bit less likely. Now, moving on from that, we have our wide receiver 3/flex plays. These are guys that I prefer in my flex. I prefer as my wide receiver 3. Like, they're just fine guys to have in there. And first up, we'll have Zay Flowers. Now, we were all over the Ravens last year. It hit with Lamar. It hit with early season Mark Andrews. Week 1, J.K. Dobbins crushed, who we were all over, and then he tears his Achilles. But we were thinking Todd Monken would pass the ball more. It's what he did in all of his previous stops. He gets to Baltimore. They were 31st in pass attempts. Now, I will say, they were a really good defense. They were a really good team. They were trampling teams at some point. Like, they murdered the Lions in that one game. So a little bit game script, but then also you have Lamar Jackson. It's tough to pass the ball a ton. And now you have Derrick Henry. Last year, they didn't even really have a good running back. They had Gus Edwards. Now you have Derrick Henry. They're going to lean on the run game again. So that's a little bit tough for Zay Flowers. It's going to be a low-volume passing offense. And then you also have Mark Andrews back in the mix, who's going to be the number 1 receiver there. So now you're the second option in a run-first offense. And Zay Flowers is a little bit tougher because he has so much gadget work that you're not going to have a ton of efficiency from his usage. And his usage, it's a little bit gimmicky. Graham Barfield broke this down really well. Usage in 10 games with Andrews, 24.3% first read target share. So that's a fantasy point stat of how often are you the first read and you're getting that target. He was a wide receiver 35 in games with Mark Andrews. 23% of his targets were designed, so screens and manufactured touches. Those were 23% of his touches, not good. Only 2 end zone targets. So he was used almost in, like, not quite Rondale Moore, Wan'Dale Robinson, but very similar usage in a better offense. That's what's scary to me. Then in games without Mark Andrews, much better first read target share. Still a lot of his targets were on screens and manufactured touches, which is scary, and then fine end zone targets without Andrews. So his upside in the red zone greatly lowered with Mark Andrews back in the mix. A lot of his touches are designed, which isn't good because those are low efficiency, kind of like junk volume, and he's just not the first read with Mark Andrews. So he then said Flowers averaged 12.6 points per game, wide receiver 17 with the increased targets when Andrews wasn't there. But then when Andrews was there, it wasn't as pretty. Now, you can certainly make the argument, well, he was a rookie. They backload the points, kind of like what we just talked about, which I think you can certainly argue. But a lot of it, too, was Mark Andrews. And again, Mark Andrews is back. Low volume passing offense, gimmicky usage. So it's a little bit tough for me to pull the trigger on Zay Flowers in that passing environment. Then we have George Pickens, wide receiver 28 for the Steelers, and he's a tough one. He is a year 3 breakout candidate. He's had a better career points per game than Drake London in that draft class, but he's been on a brutal offense as well, where the Steelers have been bottom of the league in passing volume, passing efficiency each of the last 2 years, but he did put up pretty good per route numbers despite being next to Deontay Johnson. Like, if we look at the charts from the Tank Dell screenshot, is he in there? No. Is he in this London one? No. But his yards per run was good. He's been decent. And again, that's like with the target competition of Deontay Johnson, with being with bad quarterbacks. But he now has no Deontay Johnson. Last year, he was at 16.6 points per game in his 4 games without Deontay. Those are fringe wide receiver 1 numbers, which is really nice to see. And now you're going to have similar low volume, but you're going to have much higher efficiency with Russell Wilson instead of like whatever last year was between Mason Rudolph and Kenny Pickett. So quarterback play should be better. You have Arthur Smith, who I know people hate, but Arthur Smith's actually good in that he runs a lot of play action, he runs a lot of motion, and his passing offenses are at least efficient. They're not high volume, but they're efficient, which is good for George Pickens. And we saw last year, this is a tweet from Jacob Gibbs, last year, the one that he's quote tweeting there, the Falcons had the second highest play action rate on pass plays in 2023. Of course, Arthur Smith goes from the Falcons to the Steelers, who were second last year. And the reason that's important is because play action is really good just for overall efficiency. And George Pickens was fourth in terms of yards per play action target over the last 2 years. So he is perfect for those play action passes downfield. Russell Wilson's going to be there, which is a much better fit than Kenny Pickett and Mason Rudolph, who can't really hit a receiver downfield. So all of that should be very exciting for George Pickens, who kind of profiles similar to your like Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf of Russell Wilson's heat charts back in the day used to be purely the sideline and the boundary. That's where George Pickens operates, so that's going to be really good. Again, I don't mean Tyler Lockett in terms of like Pickens catching the ball going down, but in terms of being a downfield towards the boundary type of guy, that's where George Pickens eats. So that's a good fit for him. Then we have Amari Cooper at wide receiver 29, who he was actually really good last year. As crazy that is to say, and as crazy it is to say he's wide receiver 29, he had a career-high 1,250 receiving yards last year, despite missing 2 games, and he had 4 different quarterbacks with 100 or more attempts. And he also finished last year as wide receiver 17 in points per game, and he was at 19.9 points per game, which would have been the wide receiver 6 in points per game last year in games where Dorian Thompson-Robinson and P.J. Walker didn't attempt more than 20 passes. So in games with Deshaun Watson and Joe Flacco, he was an absolute monster. And if you want to take out that late season 50 bomb, he was still at 16.3 points per game, which would have been the wide receiver 13 over that stretch. All really, really good. But the reason he's this low is we're yet to see Deshaun Watson put it together. It's tough to say that he'll bounce back at this point. In 12 career games with Deshaun Watson, he has a 13.5 point per game number. The rest of his 20 games in Cleveland have been much better without Deshaun Watson. They bring in Jerry Jeudy. They keep bringing in these passing weapons where they draft Cedric Tillman. They draft Jamari Thrash. They sign Njoku. They bring in Elijah Moore. They brought in Jerry Jeudy this offseason. So now we have added target competition. We have Deshaun Watson, who we don't know is good. So that's all limiting where you want to put him. But he is one of these guys where he is a pretty certain lock to probably finish as a wide receiver 2 here, and you can get him past wide receiver 2 prices. So I'm actually starting to come around on wanting to draft him in fantasy leagues this year. And then our last wide receiver here is Christian Kirk, wide receiver 30. And he is somebody that has just been a fine player at cost on the Jaguars. Over the last 2 years, he's the wide receiver 22 in expected points per game. And he actually set a career high in yards per out run last season at 2.07. And he was also one of 11 wide receivers with 3 or more yards per out run versus man coverage. So he was actually pretty good last year. He just had a down year with just 3 touchdowns. Then he got hurt with his groin injury. But the year before that, he had a career high 8 touchdowns. And a lot of that was because of this chart from Jacob Gibbs, where he had just 18% of the red zone targets during the plays he was on the field for in 2023. But in 2022, he was way up there, 7th in red zone targets in 2022. And a lot of that was because Calvin Ridley was there last year. Ridley had a ton of end zone targets or a ton of red zone targets. He's gone. Kirk should be back in that role. You also have, I love Brian Thomas Jr., Gabe Davis is solid. Neither of those guys were over a 20% target per out run last year. Thomas in college, Gabe Davis with the Bills. So he's going to be the favorite to lead this offense in targets. I do like the idea of a bounce back for Trevor Lawrence, and Trevor Lawrence having this monster year. They invested in the offensive line. It should be another year with Doug Peterson, and they could bounce back in a big way, and Christian Kirk could be the main beneficiary of that. Now, that is going to do it for us today. I will end on this screen so that you can just see if you just, I don't know if you want to screenshot this or if you just want to take a look at it. That is our I forgot to put Christian Kirk on the chart. But that is our top 30 fantasy wide receivers for 2024. I will say we'll probably do one of these again, like a final, like top 35 or something, right before week 1, like probably the last week of August or first week of September. So be on the lookout for that. This is just not rough draft, but just where I feel today before we do more research as the offseason goes on, and just a nice documentation of where I'm at today. And as always, if you want my complete rankings, that you can upload these straight to Underdog. I'm going to do a small little update this weekend. You can find those over at Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. You can get my Underdog rankings there, my normal rankings, my waiver wire articles in season, my rest of season rankings in season. It's all there. Subscriber leagues, everything on Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. You can find that in the description in the comment section down below. But if you can't help there, all I ask is that you hit the subscribe button. Helps the boy out a ton. this time of the year, gets us in the algorithm. We are almost in August. Training camp is starting. I'm ready to roll. As always, I appreciate you guys, and I will see y'all in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm